One afternoon in November of 1980, 28-year-old John Reed sat at a table on a hotel veranda in the tiny village of Barcelos, Brazil, which was a 2-day boat ride up a river from the Amazon jungle's largest city of Manaus. And sitting across from John was the legendary chief of the Uga Mangalula tribe, Tatunka Nara. Now, John had been in Barcelos for about 10 days now, and in that time, he'd already spoken to Tatunka many times. But still, it was like every conversation they had gave John this incredible sense of awe. He really felt like his whole life had been leading up to this exact moment of being here in Barcelos, about to go on this grand adventure. So Barcelos and Tatunka were very far away from where John had grown up. I mean, this was a very foreign place. John grew up in San Francisco, California. But even growing up in those suburbs as a kid, he had always dreamed of coming here and literally meeting Tatunka. So it was like surreal he had really done this. And if things from here on out went the way John hoped they would, he might never have to even go back to America. Because John was on a bona fide quest. John was in Barcelos to be the person who finally found the long-lost city of Aakor. Now, there was almost no record of the city ever actually existing, except for in one book called The Chronicle of Aakor, which was by this author and journalist named Carl Brugger. Carl wrote that Aakor was the capital city of a 12,000-year-old civilization, similar to the Incas or ancient Egyptians, in that they'd lived thousands of years ago and had a big empire and an extremely advanced civilization for their time. But according to Carl, Aakor and its people were way better because they were descendants from actual gods. When the Europeans eventually came to the Amazonian jungle, the people of Aakor did not get wiped out because they went underground. And it was there, underground, that they rebuilt their capital and literally hid their civilization from the modern world. And in fact, the legend said that they actually still live there now, guarding a treasure that had been given to them by the gods. Now, most people called Carl's book complete fiction and said that its author just sort of made it up to make money. But John hadn't paid any attention to the naysayers, and any possible doubts that he had completely disappeared the moment he'd finally met Tatunka. So Tatunka was not only a famous chief who knew the Amazon like the back of his hand, but more importantly, at least to John, he'd actually been interviewed in Carl's book, and he was said to be the one known person who'd actually been to Aakor who was still alive. And here Tatunka was, in the flesh, sitting across the table from John in all his Amazonian glory. He wore just a loincloth, and he had that same turtle tattoo that the book described, so John knew he was the guy, he was the chief he'd been looking for. And to John, if Tatunka was real, well then surely everything else in that book was real too. Right now though, neither John nor Tatunka were saying anything, which was unusual because normally their meetings were very animated, as Tatunka regaled John with all these amazing stories about Aakor and what it was like there in his very heavily accented English. But hearing these stories hadn't been enough for John, who really wanted to know where Aakor actually was so that he could actually see it with his own eyes. Now, so far, Tatunka had not told John where it was. He'd said that the people of Aakor wanted to stay hidden, their survival depended on it, and so he was not going to give up their location. But today, John could feel that something was different. Because just a few minutes ago, John had asked Tatunka again about literally going to Aakor, and now Tatunka had been very quiet for a very long time, like he was thinking about whether or not to finally reveal its location. And so John patiently waited. And as he sat there in this really intense silence, it was like he could almost feel Tatunka's deep wisdom oozing off of him in waves. And then finally, in his soft, very fragmented English, Tatunka began to speak. Almost 9 years later, on an evening in the spring of 1989, John's sister, 35-year-old Sandy Reed, pulled into the driveway of her San Francisco area home and got out of her car to check the mailbox. Sandy had just gotten back from her sales job, and she was tired and bleary-eyed as she, reached into the box and sort of mindlessly pulled out a stack of mail. But as she began sorting through the mail, the return address on one of the envelopes made her stop. It was a letter that was postmarked from Germany, and Sandy didn't know anybody who lived in Germany. And so she really wasn't sure what to expect as she quickly ripped it open. But as her eyes scanned the lines on the page, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. The letter was from a German detective who said that he was writing about her brother, John, and that they were sure something bad had happened to him. So John, Sandy's brother, had gone to Brazil almost a decade earlier to find the lost civilization of Aakor, and Sandy and her parents hadn't heard from him since he left. Now, during the first few weeks of John's trip, he'd written letters fairly regularly, but then his last message had come in late 1980, and after that, nothing. Now, of course, Sandy had been worried about her brother, but she also hadn't been that surprised he had gone radio silent, because Sandy and her parents were well aware that John was obsessed with Aakor, and not just that, he wanted to go on this adventure, find this lost city in the jungle, and then never come home. He wanted to stay in the jungle. And so they kind of figured that, maybe he found Aakor, or maybe he just found another village somewhere. But either way, the way they looked at it is John likely wanted to start a new life somewhere else, somewhere in the jungle, and that's probably what he had done. So for nearly a decade, that sort of became their line of thinking. But now, as Sandy is reading this letter, it was like suddenly her understanding of what was going on with her brother was totally and instantly fractured. Now she was both panicked and also totally confused about the idea that, one, John was in trouble, and two, why is the German police looking for her brother? Why is that happening? Why aren't American police looking for my brother? But as her eyes frantically scanned the page, she learned why. The detective said they were investigating the death or disappearance of John and at least 3 other people, including a German citizen, who apparently had been lured into the Amazon by a particular book about a place called Aakor. Now, this book, according to the detective, was complete junk. It was a fabrication. Aakor, not a real place. But the detective believed that someone was killing the people who came looking for it. Now, the detective said they had tried to investigate, but the Brazilian officials were being very uncooperative, and he wasn't actually allowed to go to Brazil to collect evidence to try to figure out what happened here. And so basically, he was stuck, but he wanted her to know they were looking into her brother. And so by the time Sandy finished reading this letter, she felt like, well, I have to do something. If the German police, if they can't go to Brazil, maybe I can. Sure enough, later that same year, in June, Sandy arrived in the city of Manaus in the Amazon and checked into her hotel. She knew from John's letters from 10 years ago before he disappeared that this was the general area he had been. And so her plan was, sort of roughly speaking, to search the city, turn it upside down, and see what she could learn. Now, obviously, this was a big undertaking. Manaus is a big place. But Sandy, at this point, was all in on this mission. Sandy didn't really know why. For 10 years, basically, she had no idea what happened to John, but it was like now, she felt like she was being called to do whatever she had to do to go find her brother. So she had quit her sales job, emptied her savings account, bought a flight here, and brought along a tape recorder, like an audio tape recorder, so that she would basically, not miss anything, talk to everybody and learn whatever she could and track it. And her plan basically was to just spend all her time interviewing locals, recording what they say, to try to figure out if anybody knew about John or Aakor. But almost as soon as she actually began doing this on the ground in Manaus, she realized how hard it was going to be. It had been almost a decade since her brother had gone missing. So when she met with the Brazilian law enforcement, they had virtually no details about his disappearance and really couldn't tell her anything useful. And when Sandy spoke to local residents, all she heard were endless rumors with no actual evidence. And on top of that, all the rumors she heard sort of contradicted each other. Some said a white man matching John's description had just recently been seen on the outskirts of Manaus. But then another person claimed John had been shot years ago and his bones had been found deep in the jungle. And then yet another person said, nope, none of that's true. What really happened is John found a tribe in the Amazon, not the people of Aakor, but another tribe, and he had decided to just live with them. Now, even though all this information she was getting was sort of all over the place, there still was one common reaction that almost everybody Sandy spoke to had: fear. Each time Sandy asked about Aakor, people would sort of clam up, like they were scared of it. Now, they all clearly knew about it, and most of the time when she brought it up, she was warned to sort of leave it alone, like don't talk about that. And that in some ways, looking for Aakor could get her in trouble or even killed. So as the days wore on, Sandy just felt herself feeling more and more confused and anxious. And each night, as she laid in her hotel bed, she wondered if she should just give up, that this was impossible. But then it was like every night after she'd drift off to sleep, she would have a dream about John. It was like he was haunting her. And he would say to her in these dreams that Aakor was not what he thought it would be. So just about every morning when she woke up, she'd have this sort of refound sense of purpose, and she would continue to look for her brother. But it just kept going nowhere. However, during her last few days in Manaus, based basically on finances, like she was running out of money and would have to go home soon, during that time period, she heard another rumor. And that was that John had gone into the jungle to find Aakor, but he hadn't gone in there blind. A local chief named Tatunka had told John how to get there. Now, by this point, Sandy had spent 3 weeks in Manaus and its surrounding areas and really felt completely overwhelmed. I mean, she really hadn't made much progress anywhere. There was definitely a sense of fear around Aakor, and she was even starting to feel that like looking into this could potentially get her into trouble. And in many ways, hearing about this new person, Tatunka, whether they were real or not, it actually made her scared. She would love to learn what he knew, to go find Tatunka and see if he knew where her brother was. But there was also a part of her that just feared even pursuing this lead. It was like all of a sudden, Brazil just felt too overwhelming for her. And so after learning about Tatunka, Sandy's reaction was actually to pack up and leave. But after leaving Brazil, Sandy did not just, fly to California and give up on the search for her brother. She just decided to look for her brother sort of in a roundabout way. She had heard from a local in Brazil that there was a Swiss tourist who might have seen John in the jungle. And so after Sandy left Brazil, she went to Switzerland and spoke to this tourist. And then after speaking with that tourist, she flew to Germany and she met with that detective who had sent her the initial letter she got. But neither the tourist nor the German detective had any new information. So by the end of all that, Sandy still had no answers. And by this point, she also had no money. She had completely drained her savings account trying to find her brother, and it had not worked. Now, Sandy considered just going home. I mean, she was broke, she was scared, and really she hadn't actually gotten anywhere in her search for her brother. But there was still one lead that she had not investigated, and that was Tatunka, because basically it just felt too scary. She'd abandoned it and left for Switzerland and Germany. But Sandy felt like now, if she never went back to Brazil to speak with him, she would never get any real answers. It felt like Tatunka was the key, and she had been cowardly. She needed to go back there. She needed closure. So she went back to America, but she only stayed long enough to earn some quick cash cleaning houses so that she could finance another trip to Brazil. On June 21st, 1990, so about a year after she had made her first trip, Sandy did return to Brazil. She took a small plane to the village of Barcelos, which she had learned was where Tatunka lived. This time, though, she brought some backup with her, a documentary producer and also a reporter. She felt a lot safer coming here with a group, but also she did want to draw attention and resources to eventually help her with her brother's case. When they landed at the rundown airport, Sandy and her small team deboarded and walked straight into the tiny village. In the time that she had been back in America earning cash, Sandy had done some research on Barcelos, so she knew by now that Carl Brugger's book, The Chronicle of Aakor, the book that, John had been so interested in that led him on this quest, had really spawned an entire economy in Barcelos, since tourists came to talk to Tatunka and to try to find it. He was in Barcelos. But as far as Sandy could tell, the tourist boom had not done much for the village of Barcelos. It was dirty and the houses were all very rundown shacks. She'd read that only about 3,000 people lived there. And between all of them, they only had one phone. And so as the group wandered around looking for a friendly face to give them directions, Sandy spotted a woman who was hanging her laundry up on a line outside her home. So Sandy approached her and asked if she knew where Tatunka lived. And the woman immediately nodded, which Sandy expected, because Sandy had not just read up on Barcelos, she now knew a lot about Tatunka as well. And she knew that basically everybody in this area knew his name. He was a renowned chief who'd once led an expedition for the famous explorer Jacques Cousteau. And he was a hero too. One time he had saved the lives of a dozen Brazilian soldiers after their plane had crashed in the Amazon. So the country's secret service was actually in Tatunka's debt. And also, of course, Tatunka was interviewed extensively in the Chronicle of Aakor, that book, and was the only known person who'd actually been to the city and knew its location. But more recently, Tatunka had settled into a quieter life and was running a hotel and giving boat tours to visitors along the Rio Negro. And so Sandy got directions to Tatunka's hotel from this woman, and as Sandy and her team began heading deeper into the village to go meet this guy, Sandy felt a mix of excitement and also fear. I mean, there was just something sort of heavy about finally meeting this guy. Eventually, the group came to what appeared to be a very isolated-looking hotel surrounded by a wooden gate. And inside of the gated area, up on the veranda of this hotel, was this very lean, shirtless man with a turtle tattooed on his chest. And Sandy knew immediately from the tattoo that that was Tatunka. As Sandy and her crew opened the gate and walked towards Tatunka, she pulled out a photo of her brother and held it up, along with an explanation of why she was there. And Tatunka, at first, just kind of listened and watched as they approached him, but then as he began to hear what she was saying, he smiled, and in broken English, he told Sandy he was surprised she hadn't come sooner. But Sandy didn't return his smile, because as she stared at Tatunka, all she could think of was how wrong everything was. Tatunka's face, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, none of it made any sense at all. It would turn out those dreams Sandy was having where her brother John would appear to her and tell her that, Aakor was not like he thought it would be, it would turn out that was correct. Aakor didn't exist. However, it was not just a fake city created by that author, Karl Brugger, to sell his book. No, it was something much, much weirder than that. That whole book was based almost exclusively on the stories of Tatunka, the legendary Amazonian chief who Sandy was now meeting, in front of this weird hotel. But Tatunka, the man standing in front of Sandy, was not chief of anything. In fact, he wasn't even Amazonian. In reality, this man parading around as Tatunka was just some random German man named Gunther Hawk who had fled Germany for the Amazon to avoid paying child support to his ex-wife in the 1960s. But when he arrived in the Amazon, he wanted to blend in, but he didn't speak the language, and he had this heavy German accent. So what do? Well, he created a whole made-up story about a long-lost civilization that he supposedly descended from, Aakor. The Aakor story was designed by this guy just to keep him from having to pay child support. The problem was, the Aakor story, the legend he created, worked too well. Gunther managed to convince local and even national authorities that he was an actual indigenous person. And then, fatefully, he also convinced this writer, Karl Brugger, that he really was from this lost civilization and sort of inadvertently created an entire tourism industry based on Aakor. And so when Karl's book came out, Gunther found himself in a bind. To keep his tourist revenue stream afloat, he had to keep pretending that Aakor was real and he knew where it was, while also never letting anybody get there. And both Sandy and the German police believe that to protect this secret, Gunther killed any tourists who insisted on actually visiting Aakor, including Sandy's brother, John Reed. Gunther Hawk has never been charged with murder and denies ever hurting anyone. John Reed's body was never found. The author, Karl Brugger, was shot to death in 1984 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and rumors still circulate about who killed him and why. And as of 2024, Gunther Hawk was confirmed to be alive and still living in Barcelos, and still insisting that Aakor is real. To this day, explorers still travel to Barcelos to try and find it. The second and final story for this episode is called The Parable. On the night of November 14th, 1994, 56-year-old DeWitt Finley drove his pickup truck up a snowy single-lane highway in the Oregon mountains. It was late, but DeWitt was incredibly alert, and it was taking every ounce of his concentration to not crash. It was snowing really, really hard, and the road was incredibly icy. Not to mention, DeWitt was towing a camper van behind his truck, and the van was sort of sliding around and causing DeWitt to feel really unbalanced as he drove. And so as he's driving along, white-knuckling here, all he could think about was how having taken this route was such a bad idea. So DeWitt was a traveling salesman, and he sold fancy camper vans, which was why he had one on the back of his truck, to drive it around from city to city and to show it off to potential new customers. He'd just been in the Oregon coastal town of Coos Bay and was now driving to Grants Pass, which was in the southern part of the state. Now, the drive should have only taken about 2.5 hours, but DeWitt had decided to take a longer, more scenic route that cut through the mountainous national forest. Except that now, instead of experiencing a tranquil, peaceful drive with lush, stunning Oregon scenery, he was stuck in a snowstorm and fighting his way up a steep, heavily forested slope with a cliff on one side. Now, for just about anybody, this would be a harrowing experience. But for DeWitt, he was especially out of his element. He was from sunny Los Angeles, California. He never drove in conditions like this. And he had only very recently moved to Montana this past summer with his fiancée and 2 kids. And while Montana did have some harsh winters, he hadn't experienced them yet. So this was really a novel experience. But DeWitt was a very religious man. And so as this drive was spiking his heart rate and making him so stressed out, he's white-knuckling his way up this pass, all he began to do was just quietly, internally pray. And for a time, this all seemed to work. Maybe the prayer was working. He was staying on the road. He was making his way. He thought, I'm going to get through this. But eventually, the truck began to slide on the slippery conditions, and DeWitt sort of panicked and hit the brakes as hard as he could, which caused the vehicle to slide even more. And then the next few seconds were just a blur of snow and darkness and trees. And then after what felt like an eternity, where he's thinking, oh my God, I'm going to go off the cliff, his truck slammed into a snowbank, keeping him from falling off the cliff. After that, everything went quiet and still. And for a moment, DeWitt just sat there, completely stunned. His heart was hammering in his chest and his whole body was vibrating with adrenaline. But after a few minutes, DeWitt calmed down enough that he was able to kind of assess the situation. Number one, he didn't go off the cliff. So that was a huge win. He survived. And then he checked himself out, and amazingly, he didn't appear to have any injuries. And also, from the inside, it seemed like his truck was okay too. Maybe he dinged up the outside, from hitting the snowbank, but it just seems like he slid off the road and he was basically okay. To DeWitt, this felt like a miracle. He immediately felt like all that praying he had done had worked. God was looking out for him and saved him. However, when DeWitt put his truck in reverse and attempted to drive out of the snowbank, his tires just spun. They couldn't get traction. And so he realized, yeah, I survived the crash, but I may not be able to move. And I am up in the middle of the wilderness of the Oregon mountains. It's snowing like crazy. What do I do? Also, it's the middle of the night. He doesn't have a phone, doesn't have a radio, so he has no way to call anyone for help. He also wasn't expecting to be stuck, by the side of the road, so he didn't have food or water or really any provisions. And he also hadn't seen another vehicle for a really long time. So he had no idea how frequently people use this road, especially in the winter. And also, he wasn't even supposed to be on this route. So if anybody went looking for him, they wouldn't look here. However, just as, panic began to overwhelm him, DeWitt took a deep breath, said another prayer. God had already saved him once, and DeWitt just had to trust that he would do it again. Somehow, DeWitt was able to calm down enough, maybe it was his faith, that he was able to sleep. However, when he woke up, it was clear, one, it's still snowing outside, but worse, it had been snowing clearly all night because his truck was now way more buried in snow. The snow literally made it all the way up to the edge of his window. It's like multiple feet of snow out there. And so DeWitt, he turned his car back on and he threw it in reverse again, seeing if maybe now he'd be able to back out. Pretty unlikely, but as soon as he hit the accelerator, the tires clearly spun, he didn't move. Now, it was daylight, and so he's thinking, okay, maybe now I can look around and see a house, a building, or some sign of life somewhere in the distance, just to give me a sense of how close I am to other people. But when he looked out his window, all he could see in every direction were trees and snow. He actually couldn't even see the road anymore and had no idea where it was, since he'd gotten all turned around during the crash. And so he's just like in this whiteout, basically. And so DeWitt, at this point, was trying his best not to panic. And so instead, he focused on, what do I have? What supplies do I have right now? And he sort of began looking around the inside of his truck. And he found he actually had a lot of useful stuff in here. There were some cushions and a sheet, so he could make a bed for himself to curl up in. And he could also use the truck's heater to keep himself warm and to melt snow for drinking water. He'd obviously just have to be, careful not to burn too much fuel. Also, DeWitt had the camper that was attached to the back of his truck, which you would think would be great for a situation like this. You can just live in the camper until you get rescued. Except DeWitt knew this was not really a real camper. It was a demo model. It was unfurnished, there was no heat, no supplies, nothing. It was really just a shell, so not that useful. But once DeWitt was done doing this mental inventory, even though in some ways he had basically realized, I have very little, he actually felt a sense of calm come over him. He felt like, what? I have enough to keep me alive for a while, and in that time, I'm gonna be found. And so he would just leave it up to God to save him once again. 2 days later, the storm finally let up. But even with the now clear weather, the snow didn't melt. And then soon after that, another storm came and dumped more snow and ice all over his truck. Also, during this time frame, DeWitt didn't see any other cars or trucks or plows. So he had a feeling that the road he had crashed on was now so clogged with snow, it wasn't even usable. But even though at this point DeWitt was extremely hungry, he had no food, it's been several days here, he also was warm and dry inside of his truck. And critically, he was also hydrated. He'd been drinking plenty of melted snow, so he was, surviving as best as he could. And then also, to ward off all the negative, intrusive thoughts about what could happen to him out here, DeWitt had begun to pass the time by meticulously crossing off the days in his yearly planning calendar and also writing letters. DeWitt always carried around pen, paper, and envelopes inside of his work bag, which he obviously had with him. So he had begun writing to the people he loved, his fiancée, his sons, and even to his boss to explain what had happened and why he had missed work. And in each letter, DeWitt did not sound scared or sad. In fact, if anything, he seemed rejuvenated. He seemed happy. He would reflect on how much love and joy was in his life and how lucky he was to have that. And he would tell the people he was writing letters to, like his fiancée and sons, that he really wasn't worried. He knew he was going to be okay because God was clearly looking out for him. The days turned into weeks, but DeWitt continued to stay warm and basically comfortable and alive, even without any food. But DeWitt believed that his hunger actually was a sign that God was looking out for him. DeWitt had no idea how long somebody could live literally without eating. But after 2 months, DeWitt had tracked the days in his calendar. 2 months had gone by. DeWitt felt like, I should be dead. I haven't eaten in 2 months. But he wasn't dead. And he felt like that was a sign. God was keeping him alive for his eventual rescue. It has to be. On the morning of May 20th, 1995, a teenager, along with his girlfriend, drove up the same mountain road that DeWitt had been on when he got into his accident. And even though it was May, there was quite a bit of snow still, and the road was still quite icy. And about halfway up a particularly steep incline, this teenage kid lost control of his truck, it began to skid, and he went off the road and crashed into a snowbank. Luckily, the teenager and his girlfriend were okay. And for a minute, they just sat there kind of dazed. And then the driver put the car in reverse and tried to move, but the car wouldn't move. The tires just spun. So eventually, the teenager climbed out of the car to examine his vehicle to see if there was serious damage here or if he was just stuck in the snow. But when he did this, when he climbed out of his vehicle, he looked just up the road a ways, and off the side of the road, basically equal to where he was relative to the road, was another vehicle. It was a pickup truck with a camper attached to it that was clearly half buried in the melting snow. And so the teenager told his girlfriend that he was going to go take a look in case, somebody else had a wreck and they needed help. So this kid, he leaves his girlfriend and he hikes over to the truck. And when he gets there, he can't see inside of it. It's covered with too much snow. But he brushes off some of the snow, revealing one of the windows into the truck. And he looked in, and for a second, he couldn't quite see what was in there. But then eventually he saw it. And when he did, he just gasped and backed up. After DeWitt crashed, he was certain he was going to be rescued. He knew he was in an isolated part of this mountain. I mean, he clearly knew that, but he really believed that God was going to save him. He felt like it was God who kept him from going off the cliff, and now God was going to intervene and save him, that somebody was going to show up and rescue him, effectively because of God. So because of that belief, because of how strongly he believed that, DeWitt did not get out of his truck. I mean, he got out maybe to use the bathroom, but for the most part, he stayed in his truck. And unfortunately, had he just gotten out and really looked around, he would have seen there was actually a paved path that, due to the way the winds whip on that side of the mountain, the snow doesn't stick to the ground. And so even with a huge snowstorm, he would have seen a black paved path going down the mountainside, and he could have walked it down to civilization, and it would have saved him. But DeWitt was so convinced that if he just waited here, somebody would save him because God was going to save him again. He just didn't leave his truck. And then when he began to feel that incredible ache from the starvation, the fact that he wasn't dying, months in with no food, it sort of built that resolve inside of him that clearly God has a plan. Clearly, I should be dead right now and I am not. I need to maintain faith and I'm going to be saved. And in many ways, that's beautiful. It's poetic in some ways. But it ultimately led to his death. That teenage driver who happened to get into a car accident up on that mountain road, who then saw the truck and the camper, well, that was obviously DeWitt's truck and camper. And when the teenager walked over and cleared the window and looked inside, he saw DeWitt, who was deceased inside of the truck. DeWitt ultimately died of starvation, most likely on January 19th, which is the final day that he crossed off on his calendar. On a warm Nebraska evening in late September 2012, 36-year-old Dave Krupa left work feeling better than he had in weeks. He was thinking about the woman he had met that afternoon in the auto body shop where he worked. Dave had been helping another customer when this woman arrived, but as soon as he saw her, he completely forgot about what he was doing and just stared. Her name was Carrie Farber. She was 5'7" tall, she was slender and tanned with light brown hair, and she had hazel eyes and a dazzling smile. Dave had suddenly felt like he was right back in high school, all thumbs as he handed change to the customer standing in front of her. Then, Carrie stepped to the counter, gave Dave a friendly nod, and told him her black Ford Explorer needed some minor but immediate maintenance work. As they arranged for Carrie to bring her car right then into the service area, Dave had felt an instant sense of ease and attraction between the two of them. The last 6 months had been difficult for Dave, and unexpected moments like this one were very welcome. Dave had moved to Omaha, Nebraska from his home state of Iowa 5 months earlier in April after he and his longtime girlfriend Amy had both agreed it was time to end their 10-year-long relationship. And once he had arrived in Nebraska, he'd been offered a manager job at this Hyatt Tire auto body shop. The oldest of 3 brothers born to deeply religious Southern Baptist parents, Dave had worked hard at being a good boyfriend and provider and a great dad. He and his ex-girlfriend Amy had parted on friendly terms and worked out a custody arrangement so Dave could see their 2 children a couple times a week. But even so, his small, barely furnished apartment not far from the auto body shop had felt depressing. And since Dave had been in this very serious relationship for the last decade, he had arrived in this new city without any idea how to re-enter the dating scene. He had signed up for a dating website called Plenty of Fish within a few weeks of his arrival in town, and over the summer he had in fact gone on maybe a dozen dates with several women he had met online. But seeing this woman, Carrie, in his auto shop was different. It was the first time in a long time Dave had met someone the old-fashioned way, through a chance in-person encounter rather than by surfing pictures and descriptions posted on the Plenty of Fish website. Now, as Dave walked away from the auto shop over to where his car was parked in the lot to head home for the night, he wished that he had just asked Carrie out on a date when he had a chance to earlier in the day. But at the same time, he thought to himself, it would have been unprofessional or maybe even inappropriate for him to be asking a customer out. And after all, maybe he had just imagined that the attraction he had felt was mutual. Dave climbed into his car, turned the key, and started up the engine. And as he pulled out of the lot, he thought to himself, maybe if Carrie was actually interested in him, she'd come back. 2 weeks after meeting Carrie, while Dave was scrolling through profiles on Plenty of Fish, he suddenly felt a rush of excitement. Right there on the screen in front of him was Carrie's picture. Her hair was a little bit different, but the eyes and the smile were the same. She was 37 years old, and she lived an hour away in her hometown of Macedonia, Iowa, and she worked at a computer programming company in Omaha, just a block from Dave's apartment. She was beautiful, and, most importantly, she was available. Dave remembered that sense of mutual attraction he believed they had felt in the auto body shop, and so he typed out a message. "Hey, I know you." He waited for a minute, then kept on scrolling through other profiles, but he wasn't really looking anymore. He was just hoping to hear the ping of an incoming reply. And he didn't have to wait long. "Hey," her text to him read, "I know you too." And over the next 2 weeks, Dave and Carrie would text each other almost every day. And then, about 1 month after Carrie's first visit to the Hyatt Tire auto body shop, she made a second visit, claiming that her windows were sticking. Standing next to each other in the parking lot, Dave did not even wait to write up the service order. He just immediately asked Carrie if she wanted to go out with him. Carrie said yes, and the next evening, Carrie and Dave were sitting across from each other at the Applebee's Bar and Grill at the Omaha Oakview Mall. And it was great. It was clear that both Carrie and Dave had been thinking about each other over the past month, and now that they were together, Dave found Carrie not only beautiful, but very smart and funny as well. For her part, Carrie found Dave, a former football player who had also served in the National Guard before getting his associate's degree in automotive engineering, attractive and engaging. Carrie liked that Dave was a down-to-earth blue-collar guy who worked with his hands. They were also both single parents who were very involved with their children. They both liked to read and talk about books, they both had busy jobs, and neither of them wanted to take life too seriously. A few hours later, Carrie and Dave walked into Dave's apartment, the air between them electric, but before they could even settle in together on the couch, they jumped when they heard the sound of someone knocking on the door. Annoyed, Dave got up from the couch and walked over to the door, and when he looked through the peephole, he wasn't all that surprised at who he saw standing on the other side. Her name was Liz Gollier. She was an attractive, energetic 37-year-old single mom who ran her own house cleaning business, and she was the first woman Dave had dated since he had arrived in Omaha. Liz and Dave had found each other physically attractive and had had some fun times together, but over the last couple of months, it was clear to both of them that their relationship was really just fizzling out. Earlier that night, while Dave was at Applebee's with Carrie, Liz had texted him asking if she could come by his apartment that evening and just pick up some of her belongings that she had left there. Dave had ignored her, and so wanting to get this over with, Liz had decided to swing by anyways. From Dave's perspective, Liz's timing could not have been worse, and he wished he had just responded to her earlier messages to tell her, hey, come by another day, but he didn't, so here they were in this awkward situation. Before opening the door, Dave turned and briefly explained the situation to Carrie, who was still on the couch, and Carrie appeared to handle the situation well, and she stood up like she was going to leave. Dave then proceeded to open the door and said hello to Liz, and Liz, who saw Carrie, instantly recognized the situation she had just interrupted, and so she turned red in the face and she apologized, and then she just kind of stood there in the doorway not doing anything. Carrie grabbed her bag and looked over at Dave and said, "Give me a call when you get this sorted out," and then she walked out of his apartment. Neither woman acknowledged the other. However, Liz thought she heard Carrie say, "bitch," under her breath as she passed her. Once Carrie was gone, Dave told Liz to come inside, get your things. Liz felt horrible and kept apologizing as she moved around the apartment getting what she needed, but Dave really wasn't listening to her. He just wanted her to leave so he could call Carrie and see if they could maybe still meet up that night. Dave had always been right up front with every woman he dated. He was only interested in casual sex and general companionship. He was not interested in getting married. Ever. And in fact, this was the main reason why he was here in Omaha and not back in Council Bluffs, Iowa. His ex-girlfriend, Amy, had finally said to him that if he was not going to propose to her, he needed to leave. And so Dave left. After Liz finally had all of her things, she said a quick goodbye to Dave, and then she too hustled out the door. As soon as she was gone, Dave shut the door and then pulled out his cell phone and dialed Carrie's number. Carrie's 14-year-old son, Max, was staying overnight out of the house with Carrie's parents, so when Dave asked Carrie if it was still early enough for him to maybe come over, Carrie immediately said yes. Once Dave arrived, the two of them quickly became intimate, but before heading to the bedroom, it was Carrie, not Dave, who stepped back and said that he should know up front that she was not interested in a serious or exclusive relationship. Dave could not believe his luck. He felt like he had hit the jackpot. Over the next week, Carrie and Dave saw each other every chance they got. Carrie stopped in at Hyatt Tire, Carrie asked for Dave's help in finding her son a used car, Carrie took Dave thrift shopping and started to upgrade the furnishings in Dave's apartment, replacing his broken-down couch with a comfortable silver love seat. And then, when that week was at an end and Carrie got a big assignment at work, she eagerly accepted Dave's offer to live at his apartment for the following week so she could save 2 hours of commuting time each day. Carrie's son Max would stay with his grandparents. That week they lived together, Dave and Carrie quickly began using pet names for one another, and every morning while he was getting ready for work, Dave would find himself smiling as he listened to the sound of Carrie typing and clicking away on her laptop as she checked her email and Facebook account in the other room. On the morning of November 13th, 2012, so just a couple of days into living together in Dave's apartment, Dave got ready for work and then walked over to Carrie, who was still wearing her pajamas and was sitting on the silver love seat she had picked out for him. He gave her a kiss, which she enthusiastically returned, and then he smiled at her and said that he would see her later on, and then he stepped out into the cold. By 6:20 a.m., he was pulling out of the parking lot, making his way to work. A few hours later, at 10 a.m., Dave, who was working on a car at the auto body shop, received a text from Carrie asking him if he wanted to live together permanently. Now, Dave understood that he and Carrie had definitely gotten really close, but at the same time, he had been really clear with Carrie about not wanting a serious relationship. That is what made their week together fun, because it was temporary. He didn't like the idea of making it anything more than that, and he was thinking, Carrie made the same claim to him, that she didn't want anything serious. And so he responded to her very quickly with a text that just said, "No, not interested," thinking he would talk to Carrie later when it wasn't so busy at work. But just 20 seconds after sending that response text, Dave received an angry text message from Carrie breaking off the relationship completely. Her text said, "Fine, I hate you. I'm dating someone else and I don't want to see you anymore." And when Dave got home that night, it looked like Carrie had made good on her threat. Right down to her toothbrush, all of her things that were in Dave's apartment were now gone. Dave was shaken, but it didn't take long for reality to set in. He'd been on dates with other women who had agreed, in theory, to casual, non-exclusive relationships, only to change their minds after a couple of dates. And so this seemed like that type of situation that, Carrie was revealing how she actually felt. And so it wasn't long before Dave's shock gave way to relief. It was probably for the best that this ended now. But it turned out that Carrie was not done with Dave, at least not yet. Within 2 days, Dave's phone started blowing up with texts and emails from Carrie. She may have taken her things out of Dave's apartment, but it was instantly clear that she was not going to leave him alone. At first, the messages were angry and jealous. Carrie hated him. He had ruined her life. He was a terrible person. And even though Carrie told him she had quit her job at the computer company, which was down the road from Dave, it was clear from some of these text messages that she had to still be close by. One very creepy text Dave received said, "My favorite thing to do is to stand outside and stare at you." It wasn't long before the tone of these messages and emails shifted from vindictive and insulting to blatantly threatening. "I hate you so much that I want to drive a knife into your heart," read one message. "I will destroy your life and take your happiness," read another. And more of the texts seemed aimed not only at Dave, but also at Liz, the woman who had shown up at Dave's place on the night of Carrie and Dave's first date. One text Dave received from Carrie said, "Liz was a fat, ugly whore who deserved to die." And not long after that, Liz would actually call Dave to tell him that Carrie was sending her directly these vulgar and threatening text messages and emails. Within 2 weeks of the breakup, Dave and Liz were receiving dozens of texts and hang-up calls, as well as 50 or more emails every single day from Carrie. By November 23rd, 10 days after the breakup, Liz had had enough. She had walked into her garage that morning only to find the words "whore from Dave" spray painted on the wall. Liz immediately contacted the Omaha Police Department to report the vandalism, along with her suspicion that Carrie Farver was the person behind the property damage, given the harassing messages she and Dave had been receiving. But the police really couldn't do much about it because they couldn't find Carrie. After she broke up with Dave on November 13th, she had vanished. It was believed she was in hiding somewhere to avoid being arrested for all of the stalking she was doing. So the texts and emails just kept coming in, including disturbing messages that sounded like this. "Dave, I can see you. You're sitting in your chair with your feet propped up. You're wearing a blue shirt." Ironically, this horrible situation actually brought Dave and Liz together again because there was no one else who would understand what they were going through. They had tried to get the police involved, but there just wasn't much they could do, and so Dave and Liz had just begun to accept that this was their life. And while it might seem unimaginable to other people, to them, it had just become a new and horrible kind of normal. It was not uncommon for them to be sitting on the couch together when they would both suddenly receive a barrage of text messages from Carrie. Meanwhile, the Omaha Police Department wasn't the only law enforcement agency that had been made aware of Carrie Farver. On November 16th, so that's 3 days after the breakup, Carrie's mother, Nancy, had filed a missing persons report with the Macedonia Police Department in Iowa. When the police eventually followed up on the report by talking with Dave, Dave felt like he finally understood how Carrie, who had seemed so put together and independent when he had first met her, could have changed seemingly overnight into this crazy stalker person. The police would tell Dave that Carrie had a mental health condition called bipolar disorder, which can cause violent and sudden mood swings and bouts of depression, alternating with episodes of mania where its sufferers behave in erratic and unpredictable ways. But despite that adding some clarity to the situation, it didn't actually do anything to help Dave or Liz. They were still just getting non-stop harassed by Carrie. No matter how many times they changed their phone numbers and opened new email accounts, Carrie, with her vast knowledge of computers and technology, always found a way to find them again and continue cyberstalking them. As for Carrie, since going missing on November 13th, she had blown off a family wedding, her son's birthday, and even her own father's funeral, apologizing by text and email to her family, but asking that they leave her alone because she needed some space. In January 2013, so a couple of months after the breakup, Omaha police thought maybe they'd gotten a break in the Carrie Farver case when Dave spotted her black Ford Explorer in a parking lot near his apartment. But the inside of the car was wiped clean, and the only item of interest was a metal container of mints with a single fingerprint on them that did not match with that of any known criminal. At that point, Dave and Liz willingly turned over their phones to law enforcement for examination, but police found nothing on them that would help them close in on Carrie. Still, as long as there was a missing person report on Carrie Farver, police could not close the case until they had located her. In the summer of that year, both Dave and Liz attempted once again to try to move on with their respective lives. At the end of the summer, Liz and her 2 children planned to move out of their rented house and move in with a former boyfriend, and Dave started spending more time with his kids back in Iowa. But the harassment continued. When Dave received an email from Carrie threatening to kill Liz and showing a photo of a woman tied up in the trunk of a car, Dave called Liz, who assured him she was not the woman in the picture and that she was okay. But Liz was not okay for very long. On August 17th of that year, so 9 months after Dave and Carrie had broken up, someone set fire to Liz's rented house. And while Liz and her children were not inside the house when it burned, all 4 of the family's pets were killed. When she checked her email later that day, Liz saw there was one from Carrie that had been sent just a few hours before the fire had started. And it said, "I hope you and your children burn to death." Liz was terrified and absolutely beside herself. She had struggled through a terrible childhood, losing both of her parents by the time she was just 3 years old, and then she had grown up in the foster care system, and now everything that she had managed to build up in her life was being destroyed. Her housekeeping business was failing, her boyfriend had to help her with the bills, and her children were in danger, all because of Carrie, a woman she didn't even know. Dave, racked with guilt over involving Liz in this mess, now feared for his own family. He began to drink more heavily and he purchased a gun. Even as the police continued their investigation, the intrusions into Dave's life didn't just continue, they intensified. The auto body shop where Dave worked was vandalized. In January of 2014, while Dave was in his apartment with a date, his door handle was shaken from the outside and then a brick was thrown through his window. Dave's ex-girlfriend, Amy Flora, the mother of his 2 children, had also received threatening messages from Carrie. It seemed like anyone involved in Dave's life was becoming a target. Then, in 2015, the Carrie Farver case blew wide open. Since losing her home and pets in the fire 2 years earlier, Liz had been doing a lot of thinking. Even as she continued to receive texts, emails from Carrie, Liz wondered if maybe there was someone else behind the attacks. It just didn't make sense to her that the police had not found Carrie, and that Carrie would still be going after Liz, who was not even in any kind of serious relationship with Dave. So on December 4th of that year, Liz got in her car and drove to the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and there she told a new team of investigators who had already started to review all of the files in the Carrie Farver case that she wanted to file a restraining order not against Carrie Farver, but against Amy Flora, Dave's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his kids. When asked why, she told investigators she now believed that the person who had been sending her and Dave these thousands of text messages and emails and who had turned their lives into living hells was not Carrie Farver, but Amy Flora. And Liz believed that Carrie was not on the run or in hiding, but rather Amy had likely made Carrie disappear and then taken over all of her email and phone accounts. Liz knew this was a very serious allegation, but to her it made a lot of sense. After Dave had left her, Amy had the strongest motivation to seek revenge and to punish him for abandoning her and their children. Intrigued, the investigators asked Liz if they could download the contents of her cell phone and review all of the messages to date that were on there, and Liz immediately agreed. After nearly 3 years of this absolute madness, she was finally feeling hopeful that the police might actually put an end to it. However, Liz's nightmare was about to get a whole lot worse. At 6:42 p.m. the very next day, on the evening of December 5th, police received a frantic 911 call from the Big Lake Park in Council Falls, Iowa. It was Liz. When the police and an ambulance arrived, Liz was lying in this huge pool of blood right next to her car, and she would tell investigators that she had been sitting at a bench a little ways away when someone had come up behind her and they had jabbed a gun into her back, but she didn't recognize it as a gun. She thought someone had poked her. And so she kind of stood up and turned around to see what they were doing, and then they fired their gun at her, narrowly missing her midsection. The bullet had gone into her thigh and then also narrowly missed her bone and major arteries, and this gunman had turned and just ran away. Liz would say it was too dark to get a good look at who the shooter was. However, she was reasonably certain it was a woman, and so she told investigators it had to be Amy Flora. Who else would shoot her? At 7 p.m. that night, police arrived on Amy's doorstep with guns drawn, and they took her into the station for questioning. And despite insisting that she had been home with her kids all evening, Amy failed the lie detector test. But since they could not break Amy's alibi, the police had to let her go. On December 7th, so 3 days after the shooting, the police requested the cell phones belonging to Dave Krupa and Amy Flora. And then about 2 weeks later, using that information they had pulled from those phones, amongst other evidence they had collected, the police finally felt like they had reached a conclusion. And so they called Liz into the station, who by now was still very badly hurt from the gunshot wound, but now she was able to walk around on crutches, and they asked her if she'd be willing to help them bring Amy Flora to justice. Like Liz had previously suggested when she went to file a restraining order against Amy, The police now believed that Carrie had in fact been murdered, and her identity then used to perpetrate a 3-year-long campaign of harassment and intimidation against Dave and Liz. But to make the charges stick, they needed incriminating evidence, and they wanted Liz to reach out to Amy via email or text to see if Amy would give up any information. After they promised a terrified Liz that she would have full protection from them, she agreed to help. And sure enough, after only a few email exchanges, Liz got Amy so angry and riled up that she started talking about what she had done, and Liz just forwarded these messages to the police. And in these forwarded messages, Amy admitted to shooting Liz, almost like she was trying to brag about it. And shockingly, Amy also admitted to having killed Carrie, saying that she had died inside of her own black Ford Explorer. And sure enough, a second examination of Carrie's black Ford Explorer would lead investigators to find blood under the seats that belonged to Carrie. Police also found a match for that unknown fingerprint on the metal container of mints that was inside of Carrie's car. With all of this new evidence, it was now crystal clear who had killed Carrie and then relentlessly persecuted Dave and Liz. And that person was not Amy Flora. It was Liz. 8 months later, on December 22, 2016, in a case that would make national headlines, police arrested 41-year-old Liz Gollier for first-degree murder in the death of Carrie Farver. Liz was also charged with second-degree arson in the deliberate destruction of her rented house where she lived and where all 4 of her children's pets were burned to death. When investigators had downloaded the contents of cell phones and memory cards belonging to Liz, Dave, and Amy, along with the data from Dave's devices that Liz had access to, all the awful emails and text messages in the last 3 years, more than 60,000 of them, had IP addresses that could all be traced back to Liz. Most incriminating of all were pictures belonging to Liz that appeared to show Carrie's decomposing foot, identifiable because of the distinctive tattoo that was still visible across the bridge of the foot. It would turn out that Liz Gollier's obsession with Dave Krupa began almost immediately after their first date back in late spring of 2012. And by the time she passed Carrie Farver in Dave's apartment doorway during that awkward meeting, Liz knew any chance of a serious relationship with Dave was slipping out of reach. The text that Dave received from Carrie's phone on the morning of November 13th at around 10 a.m. about wanting to move in together permanently, and every harassing and threatening text, email, and suspicious phone call that he, Amy, and Carrie's family would receive over the next 3.5 years would all be the work of Liz Gollier. Using more than 30 different imposter email accounts, along with an app that allowed her to schedule the release of texts and emails so they arrived while she was actually with Dave, prosecutors estimated that Liz would eventually spend 40 to 50 hours every week impersonating Carrie Farver and using Carrie's own Facebook account to create the illusion that Carrie was in fact still alive. The ongoing drama would force Dave to reach out to Liz, and every time he began to pull away, she would just ratchet up the pressure and guilt Dave for bringing Carrie into Liz's life, first with acts of vandalism like spray painting her own garage wall, and later with more violent attacks, setting fire to her own home, throwing a brick through Dave's apartment window, vandalizing the auto store, and then finally shooting herself in the leg. When Dave showed a renewed interest in his ex-girlfriend Amy and told Liz he planned to move back in with her in 2016, Liz made a last-ditch attempt to derail that romance and divert attention by framing Amy for the crimes Liz herself had committed. But by late 2015, Liz would get hopelessly entangled in her own lies. By the time she walked into the police station to ask for a restraining order against Amy, police already completely suspected Liz, who seemed way too involved in every aspect of the Carrie Farver case. Even though Amy had failed the lie detector test when she was questioned about shooting Liz, Amy was actually never a serious suspect, and her alibi was unbreakable. But by pretending to ask for Liz's help in incriminating Amy, police were able to push Liz into revealing her own deceptions. Although Carrie's body was never found, the evidence and testimony presented by prosecutors at Liz Gollier's trial paint a sad and grisly picture of Carrie Farver's last moments. 3 years earlier, after Dave had kissed Carrie goodbye and stepped out into the cold morning air of November 13th, 2012, Carrie would finish her coffee, close up her laptop, and get herself ready for work. Once she was ready, she too stepped out into the cold morning air to head into her office. And when Carrie got into her black Ford Explorer in the parking lot, Liz Gollier, who likely had been hiding and waiting nearby, just waiting for Carrie to come outside, rushed over to her vehicle and somehow convinced Carrie to let her get inside with her. And then shortly after Liz was in the passenger seat, she pulled out a knife and reached across the center console and stabbed Carrie repeatedly in the stomach, at least 3 or 4 times. It's believed Carrie knew she was going to die and began pleading with Liz to allow her to call her family to at least say goodbye. But Liz just said no and restrained her until she bled to death. Afterward, Liz took Carrie's keys and went into Dave's apartment and took all of Carrie's things out so it would look like she had left him. And then Liz drove Carrie's car with Carrie's body inside of it to some unknown location where she pulled Carrie's body out, burned it, and then disposed of it in a dumpster. Then Liz wiped Carrie's car down to remove any evidence. However, she didn't realize she had left lots of Carrie's blood underneath the seats, as well as her own fingerprint on that mint can. Liz Gollier is currently serving a life sentence at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, 107 miles southwest of Omaha, where she first met Dave Krupa. 1874, a 65-year-old man named Israel Swan sat around this roaring fire with a big group of men inside of this valley in western Colorado. The men around the fire, including Israel, were all gold prospectors, which meant they traveled the western United States looking for gold. But over the past several weeks, this group of prospectors had been trapped in this valley because of all the terrible winter storms. They had these storms coming in that each time would dump up to 6 feet of snow. But on this particular night, as Israel sat by the fire, enjoying the flames and hearing people tell stories, one of Israel's friends, one of the other gold prospectors, whose name was Alfred Packer, he stood up and basically pitched the whole group as to why they should come with him and leave the valley right now. Basically, Alfred told the group that, the weather is starting to turn a bit. It's not as bad anymore. The snow's starting to melt. And Alfred said, I know a pathway out of here that will take us out of this valley in just 2 weeks, and it'll bring us right to Breckenridge, Colorado, which was an area that was known by prospectors for having lots and lots of gold. And so Alfred's basically telling them, this is a win-win. We can get out of here sooner and we can get rich. After Alfred made this pitch, he sat back down and everybody just stayed quiet for a second. And Israel, he kind of looked around and watched to see if anybody would take Alfred up on his proposition. Now, Israel knew, unlike him, most of the other prospectors didn't like Alfred. They said he was lazy and difficult. But Israel felt like that was really not the reason they did not like his friend. He believed the reason other people did not like Alfred was because Alfred had epilepsy, which meant he periodically had seizures. And because he had seizures, it kind of made him a liability for journeys like this, where, the whole group really needs to rely on everybody, and everybody needs to pull their own weight. And so they were kind of worried about a guy who at any moment could just become kind of useless because he was having a seizure. But for Israel, Alfred's epilepsy really didn't matter. He didn't feel like Alfred was some huge liability. He felt like Alfred was actually very smart and quite bold. And so for him to stand up and make this pitch just kind of felt like in keeping with who he was. He was somebody that wanted to get things done, and Israel liked that about him. However, just because Israel liked Alfred, that didn't mean he was just going to naturally go with Alfred and do his big plan, but he was at least thinking about it. And as Israel was weighing out the pros and cons of, whether or not he should go with Alfred, he happened to look across the fire and he saw one of the men, this really big guy, was sitting there looking really serious and just shaking his head slowly back and forth like, no, you guys can't be considering leaving early. And then the big guy stood up and he held out his hand right in front of Alfred, basically telling him, don't say another word. And then this guy, while still looking at Alfred, he said, if you leave right now, all of your friends will die. And then this big guy sat back down again, and then everybody around the fire just sat there really tense for a few seconds in total silence. The big man who had just spoken was not a gold prospector. He was actually very different than the rest of the people sitting around this fire. His name was Ure, and he was a Native American chief of the Tabawatch band of the Ute tribe. And Chief Ure had actually saved the lives of everybody, Israel and Alfred included, who was sitting around this fire. Because a few weeks earlier, this whole group of gold prospectors had wound up lost in this valley, which was the valley where Chief Ure lived with his tribe, and he had found them stumbling around on the brink of death with all the snow coming down. And so Chief Ure and his people brought the prospectors some food and water. They helped them set up a campsite right near a river, and then Chief Ure told them to stay put in this campsite and ride out the winter, and then in the springtime, when the snow melts, it'll be safe for you all to leave. Now, at first, the gold prospectors were only thankful and just totally psyched that Chief Ure had found them and given them this campsite. I mean, this was great. And so they had no problem agreeing to, wait until the spring to finally leave. But now, after several weeks of being kind of trapped in this camp, the whole group was really starting to get restless. They were worried if they didn't leave soon, there'd be no more gold for them to mine. And for Israel specifically, there was even more pressure on him to go out and find gold, because he had told his family that this would be his last treasure hunting adventure ever. And so he really couldn't go home empty-handed. He literally needed the gold in order to continue to survive and take care of his family. So when Alfred stood up and broke the kind of tense silence and said to Chief Ure, thank you for your concern, but I am going to leave early and I just hope others will come with me. At that point, Israel saw the conviction in Alfred, and Israel really felt like he did need to leave now. He needed to get that gold. And so Israel said, you know what? I'll go with you as well. And then after Israel said he would go, 4 other gold prospectors also volunteered to leave early with Alfred. Chief Ure could tell he was not going to change any of these guys' minds. And so even though he felt like this was a terrible idea, he shifted his focus from trying to stop them to just trying to give them as much information as he could about the area they were going to go into. And so he called all the volunteers who'd be leaving early over to him, and then Chief Ure drew a map in the dirt on the ground, and he told Alfred and Israel and the other 4 volunteers that you have to follow the river out of here. It'll bring you to this mountain range called the San Juan Mountain Range, and you cannot attempt to go over those mountains. You will not make it. You got to follow that river and go around the mountain range. And then once you do, on the other side, there will be an outpost where you can stop, get supplies, rest, and then continue the rest of the way towards Breckenridge. And then after Chief Ure had explained all this, he made sure to mark an X on his dirt map exactly where the outpost would be. And then Chief Ure just turned around and walked over to his horse and rode away. And then shortly after that, Alfred, Israel, and the rest of the gold prospectors also turned in for the night. The next morning, Israel, Alfred, and the other 4 volunteers who were going to be going on this journey, they got up early and began packing up their stuff. And as they did, one of the other gold prospectors who had not volunteered to go with them, who would be staying in the valley until the springtime, he actually came forward and said he would help them carry their supplies as far as he could go, using his horse. But at some point he would need to stop, drop off their stuff, and then they would be on their own. And so the men were very thankful about this. And so shortly after eating breakfast, they were all ready to go, and they hit the trail. As Israel and the rest of the prospectors began to hike their way up and out of the valley, they began to see off in the distance the huge jagged mountains of the San Juan mountain range, but they were careful to kind of veer closer to the north to stay along that river path because they knew they were not supposed to go up and over the mountains. And as Israel trudged through the snow in a line of men, he held on to a coffee pot, a metal coffee pot that he kept hot coals inside of. This not only kept his hands warm, but also if he ran out of matches, he could easily start a fire using the coals. It was an old trick he had learned. And so as he's clutching this magnificent warm coffee pot in the freezing cold weather, Israel heard someone walking up behind him, and so he turned around and he saw it was Alfred, and he looked totally miserable, way more miserable than Israel was. And so without even thinking about it, Israel just handed off his warm coffee pot to Alfred, and Alfred took it and clutched it and was obviously so thankful. Now, none of these gold prospectors had struck it rich. They were all basically poor. But of all these gold prospectors, Alfred really had the least of all of them. And as a result, Israel kind of felt protective of Alfred. And also, Alfred was half the age of Israel. Alfred was 30 years old. And so Israel kind of viewed Alfred as like a lost kid trying to find his way. Alfred had also confided in Israel that when the Civil War broke out in the United States, Alfred had attempted to join the Union Army on 2 different occasions because he wanted to fight the slaveholding Confederate Army. But in both cases, they kicked Alfred out for his epilepsy. But that had not stopped Alfred from tattooing on his arm his battalion information and his name. And unfortunately, because Alfred could not read or write, he misspelled his name when he gave it to the tattoo artist. And so when he got the tattoo, it did not say Alfred for his first name. It said Alfred, A-L-F-E-R-D. And from that point on, that was his name. Nobody called him Alfred, they called him Alfred. And so this was kind of embarrassing for him. And then after getting rejected from the military, Alfred had kind of bounced around from one job to the next, never really putting his roots down and never starting a family. And so again, Israel just felt like this was a guy who needed some help. And so after Alfred very happily accepted that coffee pot from Israel, he in turn reached into his jacket and pulled out a flask with some alcohol in it, and he handed it to Israel, almost like a thank you for giving me this warm coffee pot. And then the 2 friends walked side by side for a while, passing back and forth the flask and the coffee pot. And then by late afternoon that day, when the snow was really starting to come down, the prospector who had volunteered to use his horse to help move some of their supplies, he had finally reached a point where he said, my horse can't go any farther, the weather's too bad. And so he dropped all their supplies, and then he turned and headed back down the trail. And very likely, as these men watched him disappear down the trail, they all had the same thought. I just gotta suck it up for 2 weeks to get through this treacherous journey, and I will get to Breckenridge, and I will become rich. Two weeks would pass by, and Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 prospectors did not show up at that outpost that Chief Uray had pointed out, which was on the other side of the San Juan Mountains. That was going to be their first official stop before they continued the rest of the way to Breckenridge. And then another 2 weeks went by, and still they did not show up at the outpost, and they didn't show up at any of the other camps in the surrounding areas. Now, Alfred's big plan for this group was really dependent on the weather holding up. When they left, it was true that the weather was improving, it was snowing less, but within a couple of days of this group setting off on the trip, those winter storms came back with a vengeance and just dumped snow all over the valley and all across the trail this group would have been on in their attempt to leave. But the only people who knew that these men had embarked on this perilous journey was the men themselves, and then also Chief Uray and the other gold prospectors who had decided to stay in the valley until spring. But even if Chief Uray and those other prospectors knew that Alfred, Israel, and the others were in trouble, they would have no way of helping them or getting to them or even communicating to the outside world. They were completely stuck in the valley and basically couldn't do anything. And so in short, it appeared that Alfred, Israel, and the other 4 men were totally lost somewhere out in the wild, but nobody knew. But that would all change on April 16th, 1874, roughly 2 months after Israel, Alfred, and the others had begun what was supposed to be a 2-week-long journey. That morning, a group of officials who manned the outpost that Israel and Alfred and the others were supposed to go to, they were having breakfast in one of the outpost's little log cabins. And as they're eating and talking to each other, suddenly from behind them, the door to the cabin flies open, and these officials, they turn around and they see standing in the doorway is this totally disheveled looking guy with long hair that's sticking up in the air and a huge bushy beard. And in one hand, he's got a rifle, and in the other hand, he's got a metal coffee pot. And his eyes were darting like crazy side to side, and he was clearly in shock, and he was trying to speak, but he just couldn't. This man was Alfred. And it was obvious to the officials that this man is in dire need of help. And so without even asking him any questions, they whisked him inside, shut the door, got him some food, got him some water, and immediately Alfred's wolfing down the food as fast as he can until he began vomiting, at which point he apologized profusely and said, I've been starving out in the wild for weeks, and, it must have done something to my intestinal tract, it's probably damaged. But frankly, the officials did not care about the fact that he threw up all over the ground. They were worried this guy was going to die right then and there. And so the officials helped Alfred get cleaned up and put in warm clothes. And then Alfred asked them, do you have any whiskey? I want to kind of warm my body up. And they said, no problem. They handed him some whiskey. And so Alfred threw a couple of shots back. And then after that, it was pretty obvious that Alfred had kind of relaxed a little bit. And then at that point, one of the officials asked Alfred, what happened to you? As soon as Alfred was asked this question, he shut his eyes and kind of grimaced, like even the thought of what had happened to him was just too painful to think about. But after a moment of silence, Alfred, with his eyes still closed, told the officials that he had been with 5 men and they were trying to hike their way out of the valley to get to Breckenridge, Colorado to look for gold. But as they were hiking this trail, this huge storm came in and made it really hard to navigate the trail they were on. And so the group decided they would actually cut through the San Juan mountain range. The thing Chief Ure said, don't do that, do not go over the mountains. They decided to do that. But as they were traversing these treacherous mountains, it was clear that Alfred was just not keeping up with the group. And so unfortunately, they made the decision to leave Alfred behind to die. And he knew he was being abandoned to die. And so he had to watch as his 5 friends, disappeared into the snow. But amazingly, Alfred did not die. Instead, he would spend the next nearly 2 months stumbling through the snowy forest, having no idea where he was going, eating roots and flowers and looking for shelter any chance he got. But the thing that really allowed him to survive out in the wild was when he was abandoned by the 5 others, he was in possession of that coffee pot that had the coals inside of it. And so at night, he was able to start fires. And then also at one point, he was so hungry that he cooked his leather shoes in the fire and ate them because, again, this guy is starving. And so really, he was on the brink of death when he randomly stumbled into this outpost and found this cabin. After Alfred finished telling his story, the officials were just totally shocked and silent. And Alfred eventually would ask them a question. He would say, have any of my men come through here? Did anybody else survive? And they would say, no, it's only you. We have not seen anybody else. Now, the officials did not send out a search party right away, mostly because it seemed kind of obvious that Alfred's men were likely dead by this point. It's been 2 months since they started that journey. The chances are just not good that they have survived. But even if these other men were not dead yet, the officials had no idea where to begin their search. They knew that if they actually wanted to go looking for these guys, they would need Alfred to lead the search because he's the only one who knows where they could be. But Alfred was not healthy enough to go out in the wild and lead a search. And so for several weeks, Alfred just stayed in the outpost, resting and recovering. And then finally, when he was healthy enough, he would go out and lead a search party to go find the missing men. But unfortunately, he couldn't find anything. And so it wasn't until that summer, when all the snow had finally melted, that the mystery was finally solved about what happened to those other men. On August 20th, 1874, a traveling artist named John Randolph was hiking through a forest in western Colorado, roughly in the area where those other prospectors would have been walking on their attempt to leave the valley. And as John Randolph was walking through that area, he began smelling this horrible smell. And so John followed the smell until it brought him to this clearing, and then in the clearing was what looked like an old beat-up campsite. And so, being curious, John walked into the clearing to see who was in this campsite, but when he turned the corner and saw what was on the ground in the middle of this campsite, he froze, because on the ground in the middle of this campsite were 5 dead men all lying perfectly in a row. They were the source of the terrible smell. And right away, even though John was in shock from what he's seeing, he could tell that these 5 men did not die from something natural. One guy was missing his head altogether, and the other 4 had obvious signs of something being smashed really hard, probably repeatedly, into their heads. But that wasn't all. The other thing John immediately noticed is that the 5 bodies were in very different states of decay. 2 of the bodies were basically skeletons, but the other 3 were not. They were basically intact. Their chests had been cut and flayed open, but they all looked like they had died somewhat recently. In fact, one of the men looked so lively that it seemed like he was just sleeping, despite the gaping wound in his chest and his head that clearly indicated he was dead. Now, John wanted to turn and run away, But he had this morbid curiosity. He wanted to know what he was even looking at. What happened to these guys? And so, kind of against his better judgment, he walked a little bit closer to the bodies. And when he got close enough, he noticed something else that was totally off about the scene. When he was looking down at these men, he could tell that the wounds they had sustained, especially in their chest, looked surgical, like whoever had wounded them, whoever had cut them, had done so with an incredible amount of precision. This was not random hacks that got these guys killed. This was like a butcher carving up meat. And then John happened to look up from these 5 bodies, and he noticed just a little ways away was the remains of a burned out fire pit. And then there was a trail that kind of led off into the woods behind the fire. And so again, John, he wants to run, but he can't help but be really curious. And so he walked past the bodies, he went to the fire pit, and he followed that trail kind of back into the woods, and he found this ramshackle shelter kind of tucked away in the woods that was abandoned. No one was in there, but it had all the signs of someone living here for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, it was like all these pieces came together, and John realized what he had just stumbled on. Clearly, those 5 men had been murdered, and the person who murdered them very likely lived in this camp. And over the course of what looks like weeks or months, this person was butchering these men and then cooking their body parts over that fire and eating them. This is like a cannibal camp. And John, he's thinking, is this guy going to come back? Whoever lives here, are they coming back soon? He didn't know. And so kind of in a panic, he pulled out a sketchbook, he sketched the area, and then he turned and sprinted out of there to go find help. It would turn out John, the illustrator, was totally correct about what he thought was happening at that camp. After Alfred was left behind to die, those 5 other men carried on into the night up into the mountains, and then somebody attacked them, began killing them, and eating them. And that person was Alfred. That was why Alfred had survived for so long. It wasn't just that he was able to make fires at night, it was that he was able to make fires at night and eat his friends. Now, no one has ever been able to actually determine how Alfred went about killing these 5 men, or even when he killed these 5 men. All we know is that based on the investigation, 4 of his victims appeared to have been asleep when they were murdered, but the 5th victim, who actually was Israel, the one guy who really liked Alfred and looked out for him and was kind of like a father figure to him, he was the only one who showed signs of a big struggle before he was murdered. While Alfred denied killing all 5 of the men, he said that he basically only killed one of them and it was self-defense, and somebody else killed the other 4. It was kind of confusing. Despite those claims he had, the one thing Alfred never denied was the cannibalism. In fact, Alfred straight up told authorities that he grew to really like the taste of human meat. In fact, when they searched that campsite that John Randolph found, they would find the remains of a dead deer that was right near the campsite. But despite it being right there, Alfred never attempted to carve it up and eat it. He just kept going back to his stockpile of human meat and eating that. In the end, Alfred was convicted of murder and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But in 1901, when he was 92 years old, he was granted parole, and right away, Alfred became a vegetarian and then died a few years later. From the 1800s all the way through the 1900s, Bodmin's St. Lawrence Hospital was one of the largest running asylums in all of England. But in 2002, it was permanently shut down due to so many accusations of patient mistreatment. Now, after it was shut down, the property kind of fell into disrepair. It was basically abandoned. And so when it became totally overgrown, it began attracting vandals and urban explorers. And so the owners of the property finally just put up a fence all the way around the hospital, and they hired security guards to patrol the property at night to keep vandals out. And so these security guards began doing that, and very quickly they began reporting that they were seeing and hearing things they couldn't explain on this property. They'd hear things like footsteps on floors that they knew were vacant, or they'd hear doors slamming, and at least one guard claimed to have seen a gurney roll into the hallway from a room, but then when he checked the room, there was nobody in there. But perhaps the scariest account came from a security guard who, when he showed up for work that night, he was feeling kind of sick. And so when he was out walking the property, he found somewhere to lay down in one of the smaller hospital buildings. And as he was laying there with his eyes closed, he began hearing a tapping sound coming from outside. And so he stood up and he walked over to the window and he looked out into the night, but he couldn't see anything out there that would cause this tapping sound. And so he shrugged and turned back around to go lay down again. But when he turned around, standing in this room with him was this skinny woman wearing a white hospital gown, and she had this grimy black hair that was covering her face. And so the security guard is just staring at her, totally terrified, and before he could do anything, this woman just turns and walks into a wall and vanishes. To hear the full terrifying story, check out the latest episode on our newest Ballen Studios podcast called Bedtime Stories. This episode is called Night Shift, and if you want more episodes like this, Bedtime Stories releases new episodes every Wednesday, and they're available on all podcast platforms. In 1993, David Lewis was an accomplished lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas, with his wife Karen and his 9-year-old daughter. He was known to be a devoted husband and father who spent much of his off time supporting various charitable causes. On January 28th of that year, Karen and their daughter decided to leave Amarillo and go to Dallas to spend the weekend shopping together. David, who would normally go with them, decided to stay home because he did not want to miss the Super Bowl, which was that Sunday, the 31st. So Karen and their daughter left, and then a couple of days later, on the 31st, they returned to Amarillo, and they actually got back to their house right after the Super Bowl had ended. And so they anticipated going into the house and finding David either cleaning up after himself or maybe watching the post game. But when they walked in, the TV was still on and turned to the channel the Super Bowl had been on, but David was nowhere to be found. Karen noticed that the VCR was actually still recording. David was known to record all major sports games and watch them again, and so clearly he had not turned off the recording. As Karen walked around the house yelling for her husband, she wasn't that concerned. She figured he must have stepped out or something. But she went into the kitchen and she opened up the fridge and she found there was a plate with 2 freshly made turkey sandwiches on it, which was a sandwich David would often make. And she thought that was pretty weird that he would have made them and then let them sit inside the fridge. And so she closed the fridge and turned around, and on the counter in the kitchen was his wedding band and his watch. And so even though there were all these kind of strange things that Karen was finding in the house, she really wasn't that concerned. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no sign the house had been burglarized. There was no sign of a struggle. And so she assumed her husband must have stepped out to watch the second half of the game at a friend's house and that he would be back later. And so Karen stayed up for a little while, but then ultimately she went to bed thinking he would be there in the morning. But the next morning when she got up, there was no sign of her husband, and so she went to the police. Within 24 hours, the police located David's abandoned car downtown near the courthouse. Under one of the car's floor mats, they located his car keys as well as his house keys. And then within the car, they found his checkbook, his credit cards, and his driver's license, all in the places they should be. They looked into his bank activity and they saw there was a recent deposit for $5,000 into his family's account. They also saw that he recently purchased 2 plane tickets. One was from Los Angeles to Dallas, and the other was from Dallas to Amarillo, but it wasn't clear if he had used either of these tickets. When Karen was told about the found car and the strange bank activity, she told police that her husband had recently told her that he actually thought he might be in danger because he was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month in a conflict of interest case between his old law firm and a wealthy client. And David was being pressured to cover up some of the wrongdoings of his previous law firm, and he just wasn't willing to do that. He told his family that he was going to tell the truth no matter who it hurt. David understood that put a huge target on his back. While police were certainly intrigued at this new information, they didn't have any evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David. It was just a conspiracy. And so for 11 months, they looked for new leads and new information, but nothing came out, and David never popped up. He never called home. There was no sign of him. And so after 11 months, the police decided that David must have left of his own accord and that there was no foul play here, and so they closed the case. And after that, David's family unfortunately just had to accept the fact that he was gone and that more than likely no one was ever going to find him again. But in 2004, a state trooper in Washington state was on the internet just researching unsolved mysteries, and he came across a picture picture of David Lewis, and immediately he recognized that he looked exactly like an unidentified victim of a hit-and-run case he covered back in 1993. And so he pulled up the details of this hit-and-run, and he found the victim had been struck a day after David Lewis had gone missing. When this John Doe got hit, he was dressed head to toe in military clothing, he had no bags, he had no ID, and he was walking aimlessly down Highway 24 in Washington State, so 1,600 miles away from Amarillo, Texas, where David Lewis had gone missing. But despite the enormous distance between these two events, this trooper was convinced David Lewis was this John Doe. But as he's looking at the picture of David Lewis, he realizes he has glasses, and he didn't think the John Doe was wearing glasses. But just to be sure, he checked the belongings list of the John Doe, and it said he did have glasses. And it was the exact same kind that David was wearing in the picture. And eventually, DNA would confirm that David Lewis was the John Doe. Now, this solved the mystery of where David Lewis went, but it did not solve the mystery of why he went there. Why did David go to Washington, a place where he has no ties? And if David was the one who hit record on his VCR on the night of the Super Bowl, that means he would have only had less than 24 hours to move 1,600 miles to Washington State without his car. And why was he wearing military clothing? Was that his clothing? Did he buy it? Did someone make him wear it? Where was his luggage? What was he doing walking down the highway? David's assertions to his wife that his life was in danger, his demeanor as a loving family man, and the nature of his job as an attorney has many people, his family included, believing that he was the victim of foul play. But officially, the police have said David left the house of his own accord and his death was ruled an accident. In 2000, Mary Lou Morris was a 48-year-old loan officer at a Chase Bank in Houston, Texas. On the morning of October 12th, Mary Lou said goodbye to her husband, Jay, and she headed off to work. That afternoon, Jay gave his wife a phone call, but she didn't pick up. He left her a message, and she never got back to him. This was very unlike Mary Lou, and so Jay was a little bit concerned. At 5 p.m., when he still hadn't heard from her, Jay called her back, but again, she didn't pick up. So Jay called Mary Lou's supervisor, who informed Jay that Mary Lou had actually not come to work that day, and they couldn't get in touch with her either. Jay immediately knew something was wrong, and he called the police. The police had not even begun searching for her when a call came into the station from an ATV rider that happened to be on a road about 3 miles away from Mary Lou's house. And he said he spotted a smoldering car, and it looks like there's someone in the driver's seat that's obviously deceased. Earlier that day at about 10 a.m., the fire department had gotten a call about smoke in that area, but they assumed it was a controlled burn, so they didn't investigate. When the police arrived on scene, it was impossible to tell who the person was that was sitting in the driver's seat, but they were able to find a tooth fragment, and they used that to confirm that it was in fact Mary Lou Morris. It was quickly determined that this was most likely a homicide, and her attacker had probably set this up to make it appear like it could have been self-inflicted. Gasoline had been poured all over Mary Lou and all over the vehicle. However, because of how badly damaged the car and she was, they couldn't determine a cause of death, so they weren't sure if she was deceased when she was placed in the car and it was lit on fire, or if she was in the car and the fire was the cause of death. A number of Mary Lou's valuables were still inside of the car, but her wedding ring was not on her finger. Mary Lou's family and the community at large were shocked. They just could not understand why anybody would want to target such a nice person that had no enemies. The day after Mary Lou's death, a local Houston newspaper received an anonymous call from a guy who just said Mary Lou's death was an accident. And the newspaper tried to get more information, but the person hung up and they couldn't trace the call. At the same time this drama was unfolding for Mary Lou Morris, another drama was unfolding for another Houston woman with the same name. 39-year-old Mary McGinnis Morris was a successful nurse practitioner who by and large got along with all of her coworkers with one exception. A new employee at the clinic, a male nurse named Dwayne Young, was making her feel really uncomfortable. One day when Mary McGinnis got back to her desk, she found all of her pictures of her family had been flipped onto their faces, and in the middle of her desk was a piece of paper that just said death to her. And she knew right away this had to be Dwayne, but she had no way to prove it. And so that night when she went home, she told her husband Mike about this guy Dwayne, and she said, I don't feel safe at work, can you teach me how to shoot a gun? And so he did. He taught her how to shoot a gun, and then he went out and got a pistol, and she tucked it under her driver's seat in her car just in case. On October 16th, so 4 days after Mary Lou Morris was found dead, and 3 days after that anonymous phone call to the newspaper, Mary McGinnis Morris was at a drugstore after work. And as soon as she went inside, she noticed there was this strange man on the other side of the store that was just watching her. She called her best friend Lori to tell her that there was this strange guy and wanted to know what to do. And Lori said, wait for him to leave. But the guy didn't leave. He just stayed in the store and stared at Mary. And so eventually Mary said, you know what? I'm just going to pay for my stuff and get out of here. I got to stop by the office, but I'll be home in just a few minutes. I'll be totally fine. And so Mary hangs up. She buys what she needs. She leaves the store. And then 12 minutes later, she places a frantic 911 call saying someone's trying to kill her. And this 911 call was not made public because apparently on the tape, you can actually hear her being attacked. Mary McGinnis was found later that night in her car. She was deceased. She had a single gunshot wound to the head. It was clear from her 911 call that she had been attacked, and so this was almost certainly a homicide. However, her attacker tried to stage it so it looked like it was self-inflicted. The murder weapon, which was actually her pistol that was tucked underneath her seat, had been placed next to her hand on the seat next to her. None of Mary McGinnis's valuables were stolen. However, her wedding ring was missing from her finger. After Mary McGinnis Morris's death, people began to speculate that her death and Mary Lou Morris's death were connected. Specifically, this was a professional hit gone wrong. The reasoning for this theory is there was just too many coincidences. They shared the same name, they lived in the same city, they were killed within days of each other, and both of their deaths were staged to look like they were self-inflicted. And each woman was missing their wedding ring, which apparently is a common way for professional hitmen to let their clients know that the job was done. The people that subscribe to this theory believe Mary McGinnis Morris was the intended target and Mary Lou Morris was just an accident. And in fact, after killing Mary Lou Morris, the hitman must have realized, whoops, I made a mistake, and they called the newspaper to say, literally, that was a mistake. And then a couple of days later, the hit was successfully carried out on Mary McGinnis Morris. The police looked into this theory and they discovered that Mary McGinnis's husband, Mike, had recently accused her of cheating on him, and he was really upset about it. He also refused to take a polygraph test and would not allow his daughter to talk to the police. And Mary McGinnis had a $700,000 life insurance policy that Mike was in line to receive. And so immediately everybody's like, okay, obviously Mike put a hit out on his wife and that's what started this whole thing. But when they dug into it, they realized that no matter how upset Mike was, there wasn't any evidence that tied him to the killing of his wife or to Mary Lou Morris, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. As for Mary McGinnis's co-worker, Dwayne Young, who wrote "Death to Her" on her desk, it was clear that he did not like Mary, but he was ruled out as a suspect as well. And unfortunately, that's where both of these cases go cold. To date, no one's ever been charged in either murder. In 1996, Blair Adams was 31 years old and living in Surrey, British Columbia. Although in the past he had struggled with substance abuse and alcoholism, over the previous 2 years he had really gotten his act together and got a great job as a foreman at a local construction company. He was known to be a cheerful and friendly guy that did not have any known enemies. But that summer, Blair started exhibiting uncharacteristic mood swings that his mother would describe as being frequent and wild. In a matter of weeks, Blair transformed from being very calm and relaxed and friendly to being totally panicked all the time and always looking over his shoulder, and he was so stressed out he couldn't sleep at night. And he began telling his coworkers that he was fairly certain someone was trying to kill him. And they would say to him, "Blair, I don't think you're okay. You really need to see a doctor." When his mother confronted him about his erratic, paranoid behavior, he told her, "Mom, I really shouldn't tell you about it." And she said, "What's it?" And he said, "Mom, I can't say anything else." And that was it. She could never get any more information out of her son. Blair's strange behavior came to a head on Friday, July 5th, when he went to his bank and withdrew all of the cash out of his account, totaling $6,000. And he also emptied his safety deposit box, which contained thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold. 2 days later, on Sunday, he left his house and drove 30 minutes to the Canada-USA border, and he attempted to enter the United States. But being a single guy carrying a bunch of cash and jewelry and acting really nervous, he fit the profile of a drug trafficker, and so he was denied entry. Frustrated, Blair left and went back to his house, and the next day, which was Monday, he went to his construction site and he abruptly told his boss that he was quitting. And he didn't even pick up his final paycheck, he just left. After leaving the construction site, he went straight to the airport where he promptly purchased a $1,600 round trip to Frankfurt, Germany. Although we don't know why he wanted to go to Frankfurt, Germany, he did work there briefly the year before. His flight was supposed to leave the following day, which was Tuesday, but immediately after purchasing this plane ticket, Blair suddenly decided that he needed to try again to cross into the USA. So he rushed to a friend's house, he knocked on her door, she opens it up and he looks totally disheveled and he's telling her that someone's trying to kill me, I need your help getting across the border, I just got rejected a couple of days ago, can you please drive me across, you got kids, it'll look much more convincing, can you do that for me? And she was really spooked by his behavior and felt like this is not something I want to get involved with, and so she said, "Sorry, I can't help you." So Blair headed home where he hid out for the day, and then the next day, Tuesday, he went to the the airport, but instead of getting on his flight to Frankfurt, Germany, he went to the front desk and requested a refund, and it was granted. He told them that the person he was going to meet in Germany had gotten sick, and so now he couldn't go. And so the only person he could have been talking about was the girl he had briefly had a fling with when he was there for work the year earlier. But later on, investigators would talk to that German girl, and she would say she was not in touch with Blair, and she definitely was not expecting him. Blair left the airport and rented a car, which was a Nissan Altima, and he immediately went to the US-Canada border, except this time he was able to get across. He made his way to Seattle, Washington, where he went over to their airport, and then abandoned his Nissan in the middle of a parking lot, and then went down and bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. Now, he paid $770 for this one-way ticket, but he could have just purchased a round trip for half the price. But either way, he boarded the plane that night, and by Wednesday morning, he was in Washington, D.C. He got off the plane and rented another car, which was a Toyota Camry, and then drove 500 miles southwest to Knoxville, Tennessee. Blair was not seen in Knoxville until about 5:30 p.m. that evening, when he showed up at a gas station complaining of car troubles. And so the gas station attendant came out to try to help Blair, and he immediately diagnosed what the problem was. Blair was trying to start his Toyota Camry with the key to his Nissan Altima that he had abandoned in Seattle, Washington. And so the attendant pointed out that it was the wrong key, and Blair held it up and said, "No, this is the one I was using." And the guy's like, "No, it clearly says Nissan on it." And so Blair and this gas station attendant look around the car inside and out for this missing Toyota key. Blair's reaching in his pockets, he can't find it. Blair ends up calling the rental company, but they wind up being closed. And so the gas station attendant says, "Unfortunately, we're gonna have to tow your car, but I'll give you a ride to a nearby hotel." And so Blair accepted the ride, and just after 6 p.m. that night, Blair walked through the front door of the Fairfield Inn, and then promptly turned around and walked out. And then walked in, and then walked out, over and over again 5 separate times over the course of an hour, before he finally walked up to the front desk and asked for a room. The front desk attendant at the hotel said Blair was totally paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, and just totally on edge the entire time. And then after she gave him his room and he paid for it, he took the key, and instead of going up to his room, he just walked out again and then never came back. The following morning, 2 workers arrived at their construction site right across the street from the Fairfield Inn, and they discovered a body, and it would turn out to be Blair's. He was missing his socks, shoes, and pants, and he had scratches on his hands as well as on his face, but none of the abrasions were that significant. There was $4,000 in German, US, and Canadian currencies lying on the ground around him. Also spread out around Blair was his fanny pack full of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gold, a black duffel bag that contained maps and receipts, and then also that missing Toyota car key that they could not find the night before. That was lying on the ground as well. Blair's autopsy showed that he had died from a single violent blow to his stomach, but they had no idea what actually struck his stomach. Toxicology reports showed that Blair had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The only DNA evidence that was found at the crime scene was a single long strand of hair that Blair was clutching in his fist. But there's no more information about this hair online. There were no witnesses, but there was a security guard who claimed to have heard screaming, a woman's scream, coming from the area where Blair was discovered at about 3:30 in the morning. The only lead police had was the sketch of this guy that apparently people had seen Blair talking to outside of a Cracker Barrel restaurant right after Blair had left the hotel. But police were never able to identify this man. Investigators were baffled. Was Blair telling the truth that someone had been trying to kill him for weeks leading up to his death and they finally caught up to him? And if so, why didn't he tell authorities? Or was Blair delusional and he just happened to run into another killer when he was in Tennessee? Unfortunately, we still have absolutely no idea. On the far west side of Ohio lies a small town called Wilshire. In 1989, there were less than 600 people that called this place their home, and virtually all of them were middle-class Americans. Most of them were farmers or factory workers, or they worked in one of the very few small businesses in town. While Wilshire was certainly not the most exciting place to live, it did have a reputation for being a nice place to raise a family. It was a tight community of people that looked out for one another. One family that was part of the Wilshire community in 1989 was the Rogers family. They consisted of the parents, Hal and Joan. Joan went by Joe, and they were both 36 years old, and they had 2 daughters, Michelle, who was 17, and Christy, who was 14. Hal and Joe had met in high school. Joe was very outgoing and popular, and Hal was reserved and quiet. But despite their extreme differences, they actually complemented each other very nicely, and they seemed to bring out the best in the other. By their senior year, Jo had become pregnant with Michelle, and so after graduation, the teen couple got married and they moved into a dairy farm to start their life together. And a few years after that, Christy was born and their family was complete. Over the years, Hal and Jo worked extremely hard on their farm, but it just wasn't enough to pay the bills. So to make ends meet, Jo had to get a second job working nights at a factory where she drove a forklift and worked the assembly line. While life was certainly not very easy for the Rogers family, they always found a way to stay positive and upbeat. The girls were very popular in school and made friends easily, and when they were home, they were always goofing around with the farm animals that they loved. As for the parents, they always carved out time every week where just the two of them could sneak off and get breakfast or dinner together. But their simple, happy way of life would be shattered later that year when it was discovered that Hal's brother, John, who actually lived with them in a trailer on their farm property, had secretly been assaulting Michelle for the past 3 years. Michelle hadn't told anyone because John had threatened to kill her, but when inappropriate pictures of her turned up inside of his trailer, his horrible secret was out. John went to jail for a very long time, but the damage he left behind was unbelievable. Michelle couldn't even talk about what happened to her. Meanwhile, Hal, her father, was just beside himself. He could not believe that right under his nose, someone was harming his daughter, and that it was his own brother doing it. He wanted to kill his brother, but his brother was in custody, so he couldn't. And making this situation even more painful, Hal and John's mother wound up siding with John. She believed Michelle was lying and it set John up, and she began saying this publicly, and it spread all throughout town. It was just an absolute tragedy through and through, and Hal and Jo had no idea how they were going to recover from it. That's when the idea of a vacation came up. Take the kids away from this farm, away from this drama, let them be kids again, let them be stress-free, even for a couple of days. It will do them an enormous amount of good. And so Hal decided he would actually stay back at the farm and just Jo and the girls would go. It would be a girls' trip. When Jo told her daughters, they were ecstatic. They had never been on a vacation before, and in fact, neither had Jo. Jo told the girls that they needed to plan out this trip, pick the place they wanted to go, plan out the itinerary, but keep in mind they had to drive wherever this vacation was going to be, and their budget was going to be fairly tight. The girls decided on Florida, and for weeks they meticulously planned their itinerary, trying to maximize sightseeing opportunities both on the road trip and also at their destination. Finally, on May 26, 1989, the day had come for the girls to head out on their journey. They said bye to Hal, and then they loaded up into the light blue family sedan, and they were on their way. The trio drove south for about 8 hours on I-75 through Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, all the way to Georgia, which was their halfway point. They found a motel, they crashed there for the night, and then the next morning they got up early and they finished their trip all the way into Florida. And for the next couple of days, they followed their itinerary and went to amusement parks and zoos and other attractions all over the Sunshine State. They were really having a great time. In fact, on May 29th, Jo sent a postcard to Hal that she kind of jokingly said, "The girls are dragging me all over the state. All I want to do is relax." But the tone of the message was really that she and her kids were having a wonderful time. On June 1st, the girls left Orlando, Florida, and made their way to Tampa, Florida, where they planned to go to one more amusement park before they had to turn around and head back to Ohio. Hal had been told they would be back on June 3rd. But when June 3rd came and went and the girls did not show up in Ohio, Hal was not immediately concerned. Hal was very restrained and composed. He almost never showed any emotion. So when things didn't go to plan, he didn't panic. He just assumed that Jo and the girls had decided to stay a little bit longer. They had each other and they would be fine, and he would see them in a couple of days. But over the next couple of days, the girls did not show up and they never communicated with Hal. And so on June 6th, Hal went to the police and he reported his family missing. The police investigation was slow at first because there was a general belief that these women had decided to just stay out longer because they didn't want to come back to this dairy farm that now was home to a lot of terrible memories after this revelation about their uncle. But 2 days after Hal went to police, everything changed. That morning, a motel maid in Tampa, Florida, noticed something odd about room 251. She had cleaned it earlier in the week and had made the beds and put the towels up and moved the occupants' luggage onto chairs and tables so it was nice and neat. And now she was coming back to clean it about a week later, and the room still looked exactly the way it did when she had cleaned it. The beds were still made, the towels hadn't been touched, and the luggage was positioned around the room just as she had set it up. So she tells her manager, who thought it was strange enough that he called the police and told them about it. The police in Tampa went out to this motel and they discovered that room 251 was registered to missing people, Joan Rogers and her two daughters, Michelle and Christy. The motel manager told police that the trio had checked in on June 1st, but after that, no one had seen them. The police searched their room and they found their camera, and the final two pictures that had been taken were taken inside this motel room. One was of Michelle crouching down, rummaging through her suitcase, looking like she's getting ready to go out somewhere, and the other was taken from inside their room, looking out over their balcony out towards Tampa Bay as the sun was beginning to set. The rest of the search of the room did not turn up any significant evidence. All they knew was the women were not there. And so using the motel as a center point, they began searching the area, and pretty quickly they found Joe's car parked a mile away from the motel near a public boat ramp. Joe and her daughters were nowhere to be found, and initially there was nothing inside or outside the car to indicate where they might have gone. But upon closer inspection, they found two brochures sitting on the floor of the car, and on each of them was some handwriting. The first brochure had a note that was clearly written by Joe, and it was directions to the boat ramp where the car was parked. On the other brochure, the other note, the handwriting was not Joe's or her daughter's. It was some other person's handwriting, and that one was directions to the motel where Joe and her daughters were staying. The police had no idea who wrote this second note, so they started by focusing on Joe's note, the directions to this boat ramp. Specifically, they were looking at the last couple of words in her note where she wrote blue with white. And investigators assumed what this meant was when she got to this boat ramp using these directions, she needed to look out for something that was blue and white. And what would be blue and white at a boat ramp? Boats. And that's when the police made a terrible connection. 4 days earlier, the Coast Guard had made a discovery out in the bay about 25 miles away from where Joe's car had been found. At the time, no one was connecting this discovery to the three missing women from Ohio because no one in Tampa knew about the three missing women from Ohio. But now that they did know about them, the connection was obvious. While it would take 3 years to finally put all the pieces together, the police would eventually figure out what happened to Joe, Michelle, and Christy. On the morning of June 1st, they got in their car and they left Orlando and made their way to Tampa. When they got to Tampa, they couldn't find their motel. So Joe pulled over on the side of the road and she got out her brochure that had a map of the area. And as she's studying her map, trying to figure out where she is, a man approaches the car. He was white, he was in his 30s, he was average height, average build, he had blonde hair and a mustache, and was just overall kind of unremarkable and unthreatening. And so he went up to the driver's side window, and Joe rolled her window down, and he said to her, are you guys lost? I see your Ohio license plates and you're pulled over here. I'm from the area. Can I point you in the right direction? And Joe would say, actually, yeah, we're lost. We can't find our motel. Do you know where this motel is? And this guy would say, oh yeah, I know where that is. Here, give me that brochure and I'll write the directions down for you. So Joe hands the brochure up to him and a pen, and he writes down directions to the motel they're staying in. And then after he gives it back to her, Joe thanks him and he says, hey, would you guys want to come out on my boat tonight and watch the sunset out on the water? It's beautiful. And Joe and her daughters thought, you know what? This guy's friendly. He's helpful. He seems pretty nice. Sure, we'd love to go with you. And so this guy says, great. I can't wait to see you. And he proceeds to give Joe directions of how to get to this public boat ramp where his boat is. And so she takes notes on the other brochure as he's talking. And then he tells her also, when you get there tonight, look out for my boat. It's blue and white. And so she makes the note blue with white. And after that, she thanked the man not only for giving them directions, but for his generosity to allow them to come out on his boat with him that night. And as he walked back towards his car, Joe and her girls followed his directions to their motel. They got there around 12:30 p.m. They checked in. And then after that, it's not really clear how they spent their afternoon. Whether they went to the beach or a park or something like that, we don't know. But at 7:30 p.m., they were spotted leaving the motel restaurant. And then after that, they went up to their room for a little while to get ready for their trip out on this boat with their new friend. And as they were getting ready, putting their bathing suits on and shorts and jackets, Joe or Christy got out the camera and they took a picture of Michelle as she was crouched down getting ready. And they also took a picture of their view from the balcony out over the bay as the sun was starting to go down. After they were all finally ready, they put everything away in their room, they headed down to their car, and Joe drove them the mile over to the boat ramp where they parked. They saw the blue and white boat and their friend was on it waving to them. And then sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m. that night, the women boarded the boat and the man took them out into the middle of the bay. Exactly what happened out on that boat, out on the water, is not entirely clear. But what we do know for sure is that at some point, their new acquaintance turned on them. And he almost definitely assaulted all three of them. And then after he was done, he tied them all up. He tied their ankles together and he tied their arms together behind their back. And then he put a strip of duct tape over all of their mouths, but he kept their eyes open. He wanted them to see what he was going to do. And then he went into his boat and he pulled out 3 30-pound cinder blocks and he set them on the deck in front of the 3 women so they could see what he had. And then he got 3 long stretches of rope and he tied one end of each of these pieces of rope to each of the cinder blocks. And after each cinder block was securely fastened on the end of these long lines of rope, he would tie a noose on the other end of each of these lines. So there were 3 nooses and 3 cinder blocks. Then he grabbed one of the women, he stood them up, he put a noose over her neck, he tightened it down, he walked her over to the edge, and he pushed her off along with her cinder block. And so as she is struggling to stay above the water, her loved ones are in full view of her. They're watching this happen. And then at some point, she sunk below the water and didn't come up again. At that point, the man grabbed another woman, stood her up, put a noose on her neck, tightened it, and then brought her to the edge, pushed her in the water along with her cinder block. And just like before, the last woman on board the ship had to watch as her loved one struggled and eventually sunk below the surface. And then at that point, the man grabbed the last woman, he stood her up, put a noose on her neck, tightened it, and then pushed her off the edge along with the cinder block. And at some point, she too sunk below the surface and did not come up again. And at this point, the man just turned around and drove back to shore like nothing had ever happened. On June 4th, so 3 days after the 3 women were killed, because of decomposition, their bodies had bloated and they floated to the surface. The Coast Guard was alerted to their position. They pulled them out of the water, but because of their extreme decomposition at this point, because of the warm water, they weren't able to ID them. During their autopsy, they found water in each of their lungs, which confirmed they were alive when they were thrown in the water. A few days later, when Joe's car and those notes inside of the car were located near the boat ramp, and the police began to speculate that she, along with her daughters, must have boarded a boat before they disappeared, that was when they made the connection that unfortunately these 3 missing women are probably the 3 unidentified bodies that had been found in the bay a few days earlier. So on the day they make this connection, the police call Hal back in Ohio and they request the dental records of his wife and his daughters. And those records would confirm his worst nightmare. His entire family was gone. The man who killed his family was a guy named Oba Chandler, who was a suspected serial killer who liked to brag about his date with 3 women. In 1994, he was found guilty of murdering all 3 of the Rogers women, but he never took responsibility, nor did he show any remorse. For nearly 2 decades, Oba sat on death row, and not once did he get a visit from a friend or a family member. Nobody wanted to see this guy. And then finally, a little after 4 p.m. on November 17th, 2011, so roughly 22 years after Oba had murdered the Rogers women, he was led into the execution chamber inside of Florida State Prison. After he was strapped down to the gurney, a curtain was slid aside so the witnesses of the execution could see him. And then at 4:08 p.m., Hal Rogers watched calmly from the front row as the man who ruined his life, Oba Chandler, was put to death by lethal injection. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us a timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section.
We talk all night like we're something, but daylight calls it nothing. You hold my hand in the dark, then let it go when it's morning. You say my name like you mean it, but never say what we're in. It's like we're almost a feeling that you don't wanna begin. And I'm tired of guessing games. If it's real, why won't you say yes?
God, we're getting our sad. Jesus Christ, shut up already. Oh my God, I'm so sad. Nobody loves me and I never even thought that maybe that's my fault. I look for sadness, I look for pain. So when I find it, my mind is locked in place. I see it everywhere. I never even took the time to realize that maybe the problem is me. I look for pain, it's all I see. So when it comes to my conclusion of the reason, that's never me.
If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button to go ahead and finish paying for the groceries. You're just going to go outside, get the car, and bring it around to pick them up. But instead, just go out, get in your car, and drive away. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube